Hello there, everybody. So, I wanted to do something a bit more laid back today, something a bit different than the usual stuff that we go over here on this channel, because I realised that I hadn't actually gone over many of my creative influences with respect to the artwork that I produce. And so I thought that I'd actually start making some videos now and again that actually spoke to some of the artists and the art styles that have been very influential to me over the years and the reasons why they've been really influential. And today I want to focus on a cluster of really important artists that I found quite early on in my life that have been massively important to me and whose works are still very powerful to me today. I want to start this off by saying that when we think about Western art, we tend to quickly associate it to Greco-Roman examples, or I don't know, something like Renaissance or even Romanticist works, things like that. Very anatomically obedient, very grandiose, very epic pieces that we might see in some great museum. And whilst I certainly admire a lot of those works, I really appreciate the effort that's gone into them, and especially with regards to Romanticism, I'm very heavily interested in that period of art. But I draw a lot of my inspiration from the more imaginative works of predominantly English artists in the periods of the late 19th century, golden age of illustration, and also the late 20th century. And they're some of the artists that I'm going to talk about today, some of these late 20th century artists, because when I was a kid, the first real art that I came across wasn't this classical stuff. It was from some art books that my mother had from over the 70s, and they spoke to a very different breed of artist, ones that certainly knew how to draw, but they didn't restrict their figures to the anatomically correct, and they instead chose to mutate and deform and stylize these organic and humanoid shapes into wildly different and inventive new ways that really captured you when you first saw them. And there are some of the artists that I want to talk about today, some of these artists of the imagination. And I want to start first of all by talking about an artist called Roger Dean. Yeah, so like I said, the first art that I really came across came from art books that my mother had over from the 1970s, things that she used to like. And I remember there was this one book that she had called Views by Roger Dean. And I've actually still got this book now because I've kind of inherited these things from her, along with some of the other books. And I remember when I first saw this stuff, it was so captivating. I mean, I can't remember how old I must have been. I mean, it was definitely younger than 7. I probably about 6 or something like that. And I was immediately captivated by these worlds that had been created and the stylistic effect of them. And when you actually look at some of these examples that I'm putting up on the screen now, the first thing that you notice about them is how heavily stylized a lot of these works are. You've got very organic, flowing shapes in the way that he deformed the rocks and the landscapes into these wondrous contortions, matched with gradient skies and populated with scenes of strange dwellings built into the structures of the organic landscapes, or riders of strange beasts travelling across the deformed organic landscapes. And this kind of stuff, as soon as I saw it, like I said, I was immediately captivated by it. Dean has he's one of these artists that has a indistinctable, a very distinctive signature style. As soon as you look at this work, you know immediately the artist that he's made it. And he did a lot of work for prog rock bands at the time, especially for the band Yes. I don't know if you've heard of them. They were a pretty big band in the 1970s. He also did a lot of work for a video game company, a legendary video game company from the 90s called Psygnosis. They did games, a lot of them for the Amiga, like Lemmings is a very popular one that they did. Also Shadow of the Beast, which actually features Roger Dean artwork on there for some of those games. And he also designed this wonderful logo that they had, which is this image of the owl. And again, it's rendered in this beautifully stylized way. And the main power that a lot of these works carry, I think, is their ability to make you hallucinate. And as soon as you lay your eyes on them, your mind gets transported into the scenery and the scene that's going on there. And you start to wonder what people might have lived in those little houses that were built into the rock face, or where the rider was actually going on the way to that organic castle. And the ability of these works to really stimulate the mind into wonder and imaginative contemplation is a key thing that I think is unfortunately missing from a lot of the contemporary fantastical and imaginative arts around today. But I'm ultimately confident in the long term, though, that we can actually see a resurgence of that truly imaginative and exotic madness that we see in a lot of works like this. Okay, so Dean was really the one that started it off for me. And I still like to return to a lot of his works today. I mean, they have this great timeless quality about them. And yeah, so he was definitely the first one. But I want to proceed to another artist now who was really important to me, called Patrick Woodroffe. Alright, so let's talk about Patrick Woodroffe then. Again, this artist was introduced to me by my mother from another book that she had. This book was called the Mythopoeikon. I think I've pronounced that right. I've still got it actually back here on my bookshelf. I still go over it now and again. And yeah, Patrick Woodroffe, what can we say about him? His work, when you see it, it's not as stylized as Dean. It's not as dramatically idiosyncratic. It does have its own style, it has its own edge and its own character that's particular to the artist, but it's definitely not as romantically styled as Dean. But what it lacks for in that, it definitely makes up for in very, very rich hyper detail. All of these images are very feature packed. If you look at some of them, I mean, there's so many things that are going on at the same time. You've got these incredible landscapes populated by all of this really psychedelic and surreal material. Things go and everywhere, you know, things going on the ground, things going on in the background, things, sky ships going on in the air. There's always something going on in Patrick Woodroffe's work. His work is so noisy and so feature rich and hyper detailed. I absolutely love his stuff. The creature work as well that he did is absolutely splendid. Very imaginative works, you know, lots of hybrid creatures going on here, which is quite common. But again, you know, it's so idiosyncratic to his style. And it was really interesting when I found out a bit later on in my life that Patrick Woodroffe, he actually studied languages at university, so he's had no formal training whatsoever as an artist. Like myself, actually, I never wanted to do art academically, and I was never interested in doing it at college or university or anything like that, for the main reason that art was always a very personal and a very private thing for me, and I always felt that almost in a bit of an arrogant and a haughty way, if I'm being completely honest, that I could take care of that myself. I didn't need some instructor standing over me and telling me how things could go. I mean, there's definitely a double-edged sword to that, because you miss out on a lot of technique, and you miss out on practicing different ways of going about rendering images. Like I said, you miss out on a lot of technique by not going through some of the more orthodox channels, I suppose. But the really good thing about that is that you learn to cultivate and develop your own relationship to the imagery. And I certainly think that if it wasn't for my kind of arrogant decision to stay away from art in the academic sense, then I certainly wouldn't have developed the kind of style that I found now. And it's artists like this, like Patrick Woodroffe, that were my real educators, I would say. These guys were my teachers. These guys were my instructors. And they taught me they showed me what was valuable in this really rich, imaginative, and exotic kind of imagery. Woodroffe, very much like Dean, he used to do a lot of work as well for fantasy and science fiction authors for book covers in the 70s and 80s. I don't know if anybody's familiar with very, very famous books by Michael Moorcock, who created a character called Elric of Melniboné. I've actually got some of his books down there, like pulp fantasy books, basically. But if you can ever just Google search 70s and 80s concept art, or 70s and 80s book covers, and look at the sheer splendor and just imaginative brilliance that's on some of these book covers. I absolutely love it. And definitely Patrick Woodroffe really populated a lot of these things back in the day. Okay then, so now I want to talk about a final artist, very important artist to me, who's still around with us today, thankfully, and that is going to be Rodney Matthews. Yeah, so I can't remember where I originally found Rodney Matthews' work. It was probably from fantasy covers, again, or video games. All of these men have really operated in the realms of media that speak to the language of the art that they make. So, yeah, fantasy gaming, science fiction books, horror titles, video game productions like Psygnosis that we were talking about before, any realm of life that really deals in the surreal and the exotic. You can find these breeds of artists all over the place. And with Rodney Matthews, his work, I mean, again, it seems to be a kind of halfway house between the two artists that we've talked about before. He has that very, very stylized rendering that you see in Dean. But at the same time, a lot of his works are kind of like have these very rich pockets of hyper detail and imaginative expression that's found in Patrick Woodroffe's as well. So that's why I wanted to leave this artist to the last, because I think that he kind of finds a nice sweet spot between those two artists. Again, the very stylized landscapes. We have the gradient skies back on display. The ability as well, this is something that I find so brilliant about Rodney Matthews and an artist like this, is the ability to take a form and make it your own. That's the thing that I like the most from these artists. Rodney could take an organism like a stag and make it into a Rodney Matthews stag. Do you know what I mean? Or he would draw a hunk of machinery like this train image here and intuitively find a way to conform its proportions so that it still embodied what it was supposed to be, the thing that it was actually referencing, whilst at the same time embodying the artist's signature style. And this thing that I've continually gone over with this talk about idiosyncrasy, for me personally, that is the most important feature that I look out for in artists, actually. It's not technical proficiency. It's not whether, oh, have they displayed this part of the, the fibia correctly, or is this part of the neck muscle actually working properly with the shoulder. I'm not so focused around things like that, and I'm not bashing it either. I think that stuff's very important in its own right. But on a hierarchy of needs, when you look at aesthetics, for me personally, I'm much more interested in stylistics and idiosyncrasy as opposed to technical obedience or anatomical obedience with these kind of works. And Rodney Matthews, I mean, he has this in absolute spades. A lot of his works, like the creatures and the human beings, they're anatomically correct enough, but they are also deformed and stretched out and contorted in such a way that it makes them unique. It makes them stand out on their own. And when you're dealing with fantasy art and you're dealing with creature art and any of this fantastical kind of imagery, yeah, I think that you really have to have that strong ability to be able to deform things in a stylistic way. And something, when I actually look at a lot of the fantasy and concept art that's around today, it's mostly made on digital devices as opposed to the traditional mediums that a lot of these artists were using, like acrylics, or airbrush is used quite a lot as well. When you look at a lot of the contemporary concept art and fantasy art that's around today, I mean, there's just so much of it. There's way more of it now than there ever has been before, which I think is a good thing in one respect. But there's definitely something that's been lost with that, in the sense that, if I go into a shop and I look at some of these fantasy art books and I'm looking through a lot of the concept art that goes through there, the thing that really strikes me the most is that, all these images are really well drawn. The composition is spot on. It's really good. The perspective shots are great. Some of the landscapes are beautiful. The lighting is very nice. All of that compositional stuff is really strong. But what's missing from it is the thing that we've been talking about almost religiously through this video. There's hardly anything to distinguish these artists from one another. It's so samey. It's so orthodox. I mean, how many images of like bare-breasted, like anime girls with flowing robes standing in front of a big ogre monster do you have to see before it actually gets boring? And the only thing that I can really rationalize as to why that actually might be is because I think a lot of these artists have actually gone through industry channels, or they're trying to get a job in industry. If you actually look at universities today, there are new departments that have sprung up in the aftermath of the periods when artists like Roger Dean and Rodney Matthews were actually about. You have video game courses, concept design courses. You have all of these things that these artists in their day didn't have. I mean, all they had was like art class at high school, or whatever that they could do at college. Those kind of things. But today you have all of these specialized channels that people can go down, and I think that, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you've actually gone through some of these channels or know people who've actually gone through them. But I think that a lot of these channels, they teach people in a linear way, and they don't encourage them enough to find their own identity in their work. And the result of that is that people's brains get locked into and mapped into a particular way of working. And even though they might have certain things about them that differentiate them a bit, or certain preferences for color coordination, or maybe somebody likes specializing in making monsters instead of doing landscapes and things like that, this idiosyncratic aspect is lost. This imaginative wonder is lost. And even though a lot of these images, like I said, of compositionally, they're very good, I don't look at them and I don't hallucinate in the same way that I did when I look at works from Roger Dean, or I look at work by Patrick Woodroffe. Even as a 35-year-old young man now, I can still look at these pieces and just dream into them. And the reason why I can do that is not because the composition's good. It's not because, you know, the anatomical proportions are correct. It's because of the stylistics. It's because of the romance. It's because of the sheer joy and imagination that has been poured into these works. And I absolutely love these artists, like Rodney Matthews especially. I think that he actually might be one of my favourites out of all of these types, actually. And I will say this, that if you look at my work, you might be thinking, well, where's the Roger Dean in that? You know, where's the Patrick Woodroffe in that? Where's the Rodney Matthews influence? I mean, if you look at the work of XELASOMA and you actually put it side by side with a lot of these artists, there doesn't seem to be a lot of cross-correlation going on there. I mean, maybe, yeah, in some of the deformity and the organic mutational shapes, or some of the monstrous things that are sometimes in there, yeah, you could maybe make that kind of association. But the reason why my works don't immediately conform to the identity of the works that we've talked about in this video is because we're not really looking deep enough. My work is inspired originally by these artists. I do have other inspirations as well, but my work is originally inspired by these artists of the fantastical imagination. And all of my works are conforming to these artists in essence, but we have to go a bit further than that to actually see how. You see, there's a big difference between the way that I see inspiration and the way that inspiration is usually translated in industry. And I even noticed this when I went to university myself and did graphic design. This language of inspiration is really, to me, a cover word for lifting or copying. You know, carbon copying things that other people have done. And you have these books like Digital Monthly, and it's like Book of Inspiration, and all it really is are templates for other people to copy off, for other people to lift what other people have done and maybe make slight modifications. You know, it's like how Chinese and Asians take Western technology and they basically carbon copy them. They make derivative versions of them, or they find ways to make them a bit cheaper somehow in their own way. And that's happens a lot in the creative industries under the mantle of inspiration, or there's another word that I can't stand as well, like homage. You know, you see that a lot in horror movies where somebody has been totally creatively lazy and they've carbon copied somebody else's work and they've called it a homage. No, mate, you've simply been lazy. It's not a homage. It's not anything like that. It's simply being lazy, and that's the way I see it anyway. So when I say inspiration, I don't look at artists like Roger Dean and think, I really like the way that Roger Dean has contorted these rock proportions into this really interesting stylistic way. I want to do that. And then I basically make my own variation of what he's done, change the colours around a bit, maybe put a dragon in there and a big boobed woman in the middle of it and say, look at my homage to Roger Dean. Like, that's not the way that I go about things at all. That to me is like lazy lifting off what somebody else has applied their efforts to. Somebody else has basically done all the work for you, and we've basically just regurgitated that. That's not what I think when I talk about inspiration. When I look at artists, I look at essences. I try to study my relationship to the work and try to really tap into what it was that made these artists resonate with me. And the main things that make these artists have resonated with me, of course, as we've been saying, it's imagination, it's wonder, it's stylistics, it's idiosyncrasy. So I look at something like a Roger Dean or a Rodney Matthews piece, and instead of thinking, oh, how can I be like them, I think about it a lot more along the lines of, how can I capture what they have succeeded in capturing and translate that through my own filters so that I can create something completely new. So it's not about carbon copying other people under the name of inspiration. It's being inspired by the potency and the effect of what other artists have done and finding a way that I can translate that through my own idiosyncratic expression. And I think that I've achieved that very readily with XELASOMA. So yeah, even though you can look at XELASOMA's work and compare it to these artists and think, well, God, there are some small differences, but they're dramatically different. In the spirit, it's in the spirit of them, and in the essence of them, they are conjoined, because I'm echoing those parts of these images and these artists' work that have been important and translating them through my own. And I think that that's very important with these artists that I've gone over. Like, that's a lesson that you could really take from it. If you are an artist, if you are, even if you're a musician, writer, I'm using art in the most plural sense. Be inspired by other people in the spirit of what they do, not in the image of what they do. Create from yourself, create from your own life, find your own filters and pour what has been found in the successes and the triumphs of other people and bring that into your own system so you can export something completely unique, completely idiosyncratic, because there's far too much sameness in the creative world right now, and there probably always will be, because it's simply easy to lift what other people have been made as opposed to making something like a Rodney Matthews piece and doing something really stylistically interesting and really imaginative. And going back all the way to the beginning when I was thinking about Western art and the legacy of Western art and how we usually think about it in these classical or neoclassical examples in Greco-Roman stuff and things like that, I think that these works by the artists of the fantastic imagination are as much of a part of the Western heritage of anything that's found in a museum, because they stand as testaments to the imaginative and wondrous portions of our being that, from a stance of cultural anthropology, is just as valid as any Raphaelite painting or Greek statue that you can find out there. So yeah, I think that I've really covered everything that I wanted to say about these artists and why I like them. I will be talking about other art styles and artists that have inspired me and moved me over the years a bit later on, but I really wanted to start with these guys because these guys are the originators. These are my original teachers, my original instructors. So I should really say thank you to my mother for introducing some of these things to me, because they've been very important in my own life. And I will say one very important thing just before I go. You remember what I was talking about creating from things in the spirit and not in the image? Well, I've actually made my own fantastical imaginative work, of which I'm actually going to release a time-lapse of on Sunday. So this will be my own true homage, my own true inspired work to these artists, and it's going to be a piece called Remembrance. So I'm going to release the time-lapse of that on Sunday. It's a pretty good piece actually. It's turned out really well, and it captures a lot of the essential values that I find in a lot of these works and what makes them interesting, but it still has that very idiosyncratic XELASOMA style, so I think that you'll be interested to see that when it comes out. So yeah, look out for the Remembrance piece coming out this Sunday, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening to this talk on the artists of the fantastic imagination. Please look out for these artists' work online. There's many more artists out there from the 70s and the 80s and even the early 90s as well that, you know, explore this really rich and imaginative kind of expression. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now and simply say thanks very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.